Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Microsoft Dynamics GP Year-End Tips and Tricks webinar by Dynamic Consulting. Real excited to have you participate in today's webinar, and we'll go ahead and go over a brief agenda today of our call. We're going to do some introductions of who's presenting today, do a high-level overview of who is Dynamic Consulting. We know many people on today's call are new to our organization, as well as some of our customers, but it's always nice to just remind you who we are in the channel. And then we're going to jump into our fantastic content, our year-end tips and tricks, and we'd like to save questions for the end. We will keep an eye on the Q&A panel as we're going through it, but any serious, real important questions, we'll keep them to the end and be able to answer them then. So quick introductions. My name is David Gersten. I am the practice manager for sales and strategy here at Dynamic Consulting. We are excited. Today is my 1-year anniversary here at Dynamic Consulting, and my job here is to put together the sales and strategy in our SMB practice. That's our GP, Business Central, and Division practice. I've been in the channel for about 12 years, and I have about 8 years of experience in GP, and almost now 3 years of experience in the Project Madeira Business Central world. As you can see, community things I'm very involved in, IMCP, which is the International Association of Microsoft Channel Partners, a couple networking groups and things like that, and very active in the Dynamic Communities GP user group as well. My partner here on the call today is Shawn Dorward, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey, thanks, David. Good afternoon, good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Shawn Dorward. I am the practice manager for delivery and strategy for our SMB practice here at Dynamic Consulting. Just a little bit about me. I am a Microsoft MVP, quite proud of that, but even more, I'm very, very proud of my GPUG All-Star accolade that I've carried for a few years through the GPUG user group. I've been in the accounting and ERP space for a long time, over 20 years. I'm a schooled accountant, and I love with a big passion for technology. And it's just a great fit for me to talk about things like Dynamics GP and Business Central and Division, and how the accounting theory and accounting practice directly relates to the technology. I am in South Carolina, so I'm a leader in both the Charlotte and North Carolina chapter for GPUG and the Charleston chapter. I've been doing that for quite some time. I also, with some good friends of mine, do a podcast, MBS podcast. That's Mark Polino, who is a great friend of mine, and Belinda Allen, and also a great friend of mine. We do a podcast and talk about Microsoft business and stuff. It's just a fun 45 minutes where we just chat and talk about our opinions and have a good time. I'm also part of the Summit Planning Committee. I've been doing that for a few years now, and I really enjoy help building out the content. So if you're a member of GPUG, you probably have been to or heard of the Summit annual event. If you're not, we can certainly provide you some information about that wonderful user group organization. I also am the author at lifehacks365.com. That's just like Office 365, but Lifehacks365. And those are just tips and tricks that I write about and share with the community. Just things that I've come across over my time that I find helpful for folks to have just at their fingertips. You can follow me on Twitter at Lifehacks365com if you're a Twitterer, or you can find me on Facebook somehow, I think. Anyway, that's enough about me. Look forward to sharing the year-end process here in just a few minutes, and I'll turn it back over to David.
Great, thanks, Shawn, so much. Really appreciate it. And another reminder, we have to update that slide, Shawn. You're now on the content committee for directions.
That is right.
So that's real excited. So directions, again, another SMB-focused practice event that's coming up early 2020. So thanks for participating in that. So let me tell you a little bit about Dynamic Consulting real fast. We are a group of leaders that started as, most of us are all customers. So this is a group of our leadership team, our executive team, and we're all practice managers that really are focused on customer DNA. We come from being customers in the channel. John started this practice back in 2009. basically because he was a customer, an end user, and really wanted to really change how partners behave. And as a result, created a fantastic organization, built it to over 40 consultants throughout the United States, hundreds of certifications with our headquarters in Chicago. Like Shawn said, he's in South Carolina. I'm actually in Southern California. We have a big office in New York as well. But what's really important is just to show the quality. These names, you can find most of us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and we're pretty much SMEs, subject matter experts in our practice, whether or not it's SMB ERP or it's CRM or even enterprise ERP as well. All of us are very involved in the community, as I mentioned during my introduction, that I'm very involved in the GPUD community. Shawn is as well. This is was a fun, exciting event at the summit last in October during the summit in Orlando. A lot of fun. Next year, the Community Summit is what it's being called, is going to be in Nashville. Really hope that people can participate. But we had over 700 people come by our booth, and we got to really just talk to them about achieving more with Dynamics. And as part of the community, we present, we do blogs. So take a look and look us up and follow us and learn a little bit more about it. By being part of this community, it really allows us to deliver on our vision. Our vision of being invested, prepared, and accountable allows us to really deliver expertise to our customers. We really know our clients are needing to have business transformation, and in order to do it, we equip our employees with the knowledge and training to be able to apply it to the technology that's changing every day. Probably since this webinar started just a few minutes ago, the technology changed already. That's how fast things are moving. But what we do is we really invest in each of our team members to learn and apply their knowledge and really become experts in the technology so that we can deliver and become, take that knowledge and deliver it to and apply it to your operations, our customers, businesses, and really help deliver the positive experiences and business outcomes. By being so invested, we have to be prepared. And again, it's that learning, always knowing a little bit more about the solution before it really goes to market. Early adopter programs, whether or not it's preview programs, things like that. We're very involved in that. And again, taking that information, being prepared, allows us to deliver and be accountable. It's also our processes that we believe in. We do deep diagnostics in our solutions, and it does allow us to be more prepared to make sure that the deployment experience is really positive. Again, with our being invested and prepared, we hold ourselves accountable as well. Our customers hold ourselves accountable. We do believe that you can be on time, on budget, and complete your scope when the discovery and the diagnostics is done up front, and we understand the requirements well enough. But because we are invested and we're prepared, we are pretty much able to deliver on that accountability section. So we're looking forward to be able to continue to deliver invested, prepared, and accountable to our existing customers and any new customers that come to the Dynamic Consulting family. So how do we do, and what do we do? I talked about how we do it, but what do we do? I like to describe us. We're a Dynamics partner, but a lot of people we're now using the term business applications. But without even looking at the technology, what do we do for our customers? Basically, we won't let you outgrow us because we have solutions that go all the way from SMB to the enterprise space. That also, I like to say from the front door, the back door to the front door. Whether or not it's the reporting solutions through the Power Solutions, Power Platform, or it's the CRM, or even if it's Office and reporting in Azure and infrastructure, we're able to develop deeper relationships with our customers and allow you to not outgrow us by being able to move your solutions as they need to be and add different features and functionalities as you need to. And by doing this, we're using our systematic process to deliver our excellent services. I mentioned earlier the diagnostics, the blueprint, really understanding user acceptance testing, really understanding everything that is part of that delivery of services allows us to just deliver excellent services. And what do we deliver? Again, we deliver the business applications to solve your business challenges. So we're going to go ahead and start some tips and tricks. I'm going to go ahead and mute out and let Shawn take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, David, for that comprehensive background on dynamic consulting. If anyone, any of the folks on the webinar today have any questions about what we do or how we do it, we have our contact information coming up as well. If you're not already aware of how to get in touch with us, please, we do welcome that. So today, our webinar, one webinar, we offer four quarterly webinars to our customers and anyone who's interested, and this just happens to be, because of the time on the calendar, the topic today is year end. And before we get into how to close the year end and some tips and tricks for that, I wanted to point out that the year end software for US-based customers is available. I have a link in this slide deck, which I'm pretty sure we'll be able to deliver to you at the conclusion of our gathering here today. The versions supported for that are GP 2015, 2016, and Microsoft Dynamics GP. You may reference it as GP 28. There was a slight naming change this year. More on that in a blog that David wrote on our company website. If you are on GP 2015, it is important to note that your main licensing support expires. I think it's in April. So if you're interested to learn about upgrading, be sure to check with us or whomever your partner is to get that your ducks in a row there, because that is important timing, especially if you use payroll, because you need to get those tax updates every year. And 2015, this will be the last year that happens for 2015. I think that's out into March or April. I can get you more specifics on that. But this link here takes you out to a really great blog series. My friend Terry Healy has put this together, and a lot of information about just some of the things that are happening at year end. I want to make sure you're aware of this. I know you probably don't have much time to go surfing the web, just exploring. So I wanted to share this with you. A lot of information about some new features and what's coming down the pipe as far as changes in the release that's happening here. If you have questions about whether there's W-2 changes, or if there's ACA or 1095 changes, or is there the seemingly every year luxury tax change for fixed assets, all that can be found right here in this blog. If you are a Canadian-based friend, our friends to the north, I'm providing this link in here as well. That year-end update has not been finalized yet, although I heard through the grapevine it's near completion, and it could be as early as mid next week. Once that's available, then you can go ahead and schedule your year-end update. And if you're curious about when that is, you can shoot David or I an email, and we can let you know as soon as we hear from Microsoft when that is complete. So, the year-end software update, if you're not familiar with this process, I want to talk about it for just a second. So every year, part of your licensing, what Microsoft does is adds new features, tons of cool new features to talk about, especially over the past 3-5 years. Really, really relevant modern features. But in addition to that, any law changes that happen or any bug fixes. When I say law changes, I'm talking about things like depreciation or for fixed assets, payroll related, whether that's US or Canadian, and things like that. If there's form changes, maybe the 1099 for payables is now different, or some of the rules and regs around that have changed. Those updates from Microsoft as part of your license get released periodically throughout the year. There's always a year-end one, and that's what we're talking about here. This year-end update is what we call a cumulative update. So if you're on GP 2018, the release to market, or 2018 R1, some folks call it, when you apply your year-end update, you're going to get R2 and any subsequent changes, which means bug fixes, new features, and law changes. The same is true for 2016 and 2015. You're just going to go to the most modern version of that version of GP. So you go to the most modern version of GP 2016 if you're on 2016, the most modern of 2018 if you're on 2018. But it's not just for folks who use payroll. And this is sort of one of those things that kind of gets overlooked. Number one, as a Microsoft customer, you're paying for this service for them to update the software. So it's best to capture that new features and functionality, and especially for things relating to fixed assets and AP. So I recommend everyone considers it. It's not like a full-blown upgrade. So it's not as much downtime, it's not as costly, it's not as painful, air quote painful in that sense. So it's a rather easy process. Be sure to find out more information about that and take a look at what the offerings are. So what we're going to talk about here specifically for our year-end topics, we're going to go through a brief overview of closing of the modules. This hasn't changed in a very long time, so it's very sort of status quo, but I have a lot of things in here I think that you might find helpful. Remember, as David said, I was a customer as well, so I was partly responsible for the closing of the books and the fiscal year and the calendar year, and that's really what sort of dawned Life Hacks 365, were those kind of things that I felt like I just needed to remember because we only do it once a year. So it's just a good refresher if you've done it before. We'll talk about some reconciliation approaches and how you can clean up things, naturally payroll and 1099s. So a general disclaimer for literally everything we're going to talk about over the next 40 minutes or so is, you probably will hear me say it again, but in each one of these steps, without a doubt, it may seem like overkill, but it is my true recommendation that each one of these steps you do a backup of your system database and your company databases, not just your company. And I recommend folks do this before and after in case you have any reason to want to see the state of the data before the close. You can go ahead and save that off. So very, very important to make sure that you and your IT team and your partner fully utilize a strict and consistent backup plan and backup process that you've tested. That's another important part about a backup, is testing its success on a restore. Just because the backup was run does not mean you're prepared for a disaster. And you must go through a restore process to verify that your backup is successful. So closing checklist, we have, these are the modules we're going to talk about. If you have ISVs or third parties that you use, they may have a very different closing routine, or maybe none at all, depending on what it is. So it's best to get a list of your ISVs and reach out to them and see if they have any specific closing processes that you must follow. This order we're going to talk about in the process is assuming that you have no ISVs that interfere with the normal process. Most don't, so don't feel like it's an overwhelming thing to find out, but just go ahead and be prudent, just like your backups, and verify that you don't need any extra steps. I kind of classify this presentation, or this webinar, if you will. This actually was one of the first presentations I did at a GPUG meeting years ago, and I've used the same slide deck basically and just modernized it a little bit as things changed. But I've always found this to be really helpful. List of the modules and what type of closing is available. So if you take note, at payroll, there's just a calendar year closing, not a fiscal year closing. Whereas sales and purchasing has a process for each. And we're going to talk about that as we go through each module. So first up is the sales module. Now, in order for this to, let me go back to that slide, everything essentially needs to be closed before you closed your financial. There's a caveat to that, but I really want to make sure that you understand that you can't close the financial module or general ledger and then go try to close sales, for example. And you probably could, but there are reasons that you may not want to, and I talk about those prudent steps. So who should run this? So the sales closing and the purchase closing are optional. I call them optional closes. And the reality of it is it has no impact on general ledger. Now, there's still some prudent things that you should take into account as you go through this, and that's why I want to talk about this. So number one, when you close the sales module, you're really closing, I'm going to jump into GP here, you're really closing to update the buckets that get updated for year-to-date and life-to-date balances. They can be seen in a smart list as well. Let me do that. It'd probably be easier to take a look at the smart list. And I think I have one set up here with them included. So in the smart list, these are the buckets I'm referring to, this year-to-date, life-to-date, and last year buckets. These are just sort of drawing the line in the sand and updating those buckets in the system. No general ledger implications occur. The catch to this, or the challenge to this, is that it can be really dependent upon the date you run it. So if I run it right now on December 10th, this is the day of my close. So if transactions happen tomorrow, and you know they will, they're going to be considered in the new year. Notice in mine, there is no last year because I haven't closed my sales module before. Now, if you're going to close your sales module, remember I said it's optional, and you do care about these buckets, I would make an effort to close it consistently at the same time every year, meaning once all your transactions are in for the fiscal year, then go ahead and close it before your new year transactions are entered. The reality for that, though, is that's not a good business case. There's not a good business process that says we're not going to transact next year until we're done with this year. So to that degree, someone might look at these buckets and consider them not as valuable as they originally were thought to be. And I'm one of those people. I think that it's best to look at these transactions driven by date, not a point in time. So you don't have to do it. If you do it, I would just have some consistency around it. There may be some third parties that leverage those as well. So keep that in mind. So if you're using those smart list buckets, that's a good reason you'd want to run the procedure. The customer summary window is another one that has those buckets. When it should be run, I already mentioned that, at consistent time. You have options here, and you get to close, like I said, the fiscal year or the calendar year, or both at the same time. And it basically updates those year-to-date, life-to-date, and last year buckets and sort of resets the clock in that module. So it doesn't close out anything on general ledger or do any accrual for you, or those are the kind of things that we have to do on our own as part of our normal closing process. And I want to talk about that a little bit. Before I do, here's a screenshot of the customer yearly summary inquiry window, and you see the amount since last close. That bucket is available for you, and that's really one of the dependencies on the close process. Prior to closing, whether you opt to close the sales module or not, sort of irrelevant when it comes to these topics I'm going to talk about, because prior to closing the financial module, these are some of the things that I recommend you do. There's a new tool. I call it new because it's not as well known as I think it should be. It came out in maybe GP 2013. It's in the financial module. It's called Reconcile to GL. You can reconcile to the receivables module here. Notice the single arrow here is pointing to receivables management, and then you get to pick a list of accounts you want to reconcile that against. Now, you probably do something like this already if you don't use the tool. You probably grab a list of transactions from a smart list from the subsidiary and grab a list of transactions from general ledger and bump them up against one another. But that tool actually does that for you, and it uses the audit trail in the background to match them. All mine, because in my demo world, it's a perfect environment, all mine happen to be matched. But in those top two areas, you'll see unmatched transactions and potentially matched transactions. So if you have a general ledger batch that was not posted from a receivables, you posted the receivables but not the general ledger, you would only see the receivables on the left-hand side here and not on the right, kind of telling you to go peek at those areas. At the bottom, not part of the screenshot here, is a reconciliation. So in a true perfect world, and I promise you can get to that state through some restrictions around your account maintenance. I don't really cover it here today, but let me know if you're interested in learning more about that. The reconcile feature pops these out to Excel. The idea behind this is make sure that before you close financial, you're posting all your sales transactions and you're making sure everything is on general ledger, including any adjustments you may need to make. Another part of the closing process, a little tip for you, is now's a great time to go out there and use an in the product feature called customer combiner and modifier. So if you have multiple customers inadvertently or accidentally created, but they're really all one customer, this would be a great time to clean that up or clean some of them up. It doesn't have to be at year end. You could do it all throughout the year. But it is in the product under sales, utilities, customer combiner and modifier. And you can import a file to do this in bulk. Or you could do one at a time, like on the screenshot there. So on the left is the original customer ID, and on the right is the new customer ID. If the new customer ID does not exist, it'll error. But if it exists, all of that will get merged, including all your history information. So it's basically combining them into one. The old ID no longer is in the system, and the new ID will have all the information. Pretty cool stuff. Now's a great time to take all those little dollar amounts that still have been uncollected, that haunt and gunk up your receivables, aged receivables report, and write them off. There's a routine called write-off documents. This is a screenshot. You can do a write-off based on customers, and you could set a limit. And what I love about this is this does it in bulk. It creates the journal entries for you. You can set a cutoff date, but even more importantly, you get to preview them first, so you're not walking through this without some kind of review. You can also write them off individually, but a lot of times, especially with larger amounts of volume transactions, this can be a huge time saver. Customer refunds is another thing that you might want to consider doing this time of year. I know sending the money out isn't as high as a priority, but you can check out sales transactions, refund checks, and get those refunds issued. Get your customer accounts all nice and clean before the year is over. And there's a little screenshot of how to do that. This basically creates a temporary vendor for you to make the payment. Kind of a little bit of attached to closing sales and closing purchasing, which I'll talk about next, is closing of the tax year. So if you track tax in GP, you can, again, optionally close your tax year. It does the same sort of thing, draws the line in the sand, and updates all of the sales or all the tax information into a different bucket and resets the year. Real easy to do under administration routines, company tax year end close. Again, optional. You want to make sure before you close your tax year, I have this attached to the sales module, but you want to do this after you've made sure everything in AP, purchasing, and sales has been posted as well, if you choose to do it. If you've never done it before, don't feel like you heard Shawn's webinar, now you have to go do it. That's not a problem. Okay, so next, just another slide about the tax year. So I mentioned about backups. So once you close your tax year, if you choose to, and you want to close your sales module, real easy to do. You run the year-end close procedure under sales routine year-end close. Real easy to do. Notice on the screenshot, we've got an all, which is both the fiscal and the calendar year, or we can optionally elect to close just the fiscal year or the calendar year. So I'm just going to go into GP, into sales, routines, year-end close. I haven't done this before. I'm going to close both of them and hit process. Before I do, take note to these buckets here, just so you get an idea on what actually happens here. So I'm going to go ahead and process that. Close the year, I get my report. That's my customer balances that get closed. If you want to print that off to a text file. And now when I run I get a couple closing reports, probably best to save them off. I wouldn't recommend printing them, but you can save them as a text file. Now when I rerun my report in SmartList, you see that my year-to-date is now 0. Even though I'm 1210, it's because I hit that reset button. That's what those buckets do. And now you see my last year. Even though the year's not over, it's because I ran it today. If you don't use these buckets, no real reason, at least none that I can think of, to close this at all. Here's a checklist for closing the sales module, and I've identified which step makes sense depending on the type of closing that you're going to be running through. Next up is purchasing. similar concept, the year-to-date summary, year-to-date buckets. I have a purchasing vendor list here, same kind of buckets. And I have mine showing for the amount billed and the amount paid. You see the last year buckets are empty. So really not going to hammer into this too much. Similar concept, optional. You have both fiscal and calendar year options available, or you can do both. If you use those buckets, it's important to run this at a consistent time. Otherwise, when you're looking at year to date or last year compared to previous years, it's not a true comparison if you're running it at different times. Some other things you can do. Oh, here's the update the vendor yearly window to give you an idea what the buckets get affected here. Some other things that we want to talk about: closing AP at year end, very similar to sales. That same reconcile to GL, you see my module type is switched to payables management. You don't have to have just one AP account. If you use multiple, you can identify them here. Run that reconcile, make sure everything is posted, make sure everything is matched, and get yourself in a good, clean AP state for the fiscal year or the calendar year, if that's what you're working on. Most is going to be fiscal year. This is true if this is not your fiscal year close for December, whenever that is, April, June, whenever, same idea. And you have, just like the customers, you have a vendor combiner. So if you've got multiple vendors that are really truly the same one, stop that insanity. You have this tool, it's free, you own it. You can run it and combine them, and it does combine history. It even gives you, I failed to mention earlier, everyone, it gives you an audit report, so that if you're looking at a posting report from 4 months ago and it said, vendor 1, but then your auditor comes in and says, why does it say vendor 1, but on the posting report, but now it says vendor 2, you can show them your audit trail report for your vendor combiner. Want to make sure that you know that 1099s are not connected to closing the AP module. That's a common misunderstanding. I believe it may have been like that years ago. I don't know for sure. I don't have an older version of GP that justifies that or supports that, but you don't have to, in modern versions, since GP 2010 at very least, you do not have to close your purchasing module in order for 1099s to work correctly. You also do not have to not enter in new AP invoices before running your 1099s. That's also a myth. You can run your 1099s at any time. Why? Because it's based on the payment date. It's real easy. The date you paid the invoice is the date the IRS requires you to report that on the 1099. So that's all the system does is looks at that when you run it. 1099s could be a trying process. I know that's probably not on your radar till maybe January or maybe even February, hopefully not too far down that road. But it's great to do a quarterly spot check on them. I've got a lot of tips in here for 1099s. The first up is a SQL view that you can use to build a smart list. It's out on my website. It's real easy to get on your SQL server. And what that does then is you can create a smart list, and I call it 1099 audit. And what this does is it looks out at all of the 1099 buckets that are available by each vendor for each year. So this particular vendor, Beaumont Construction, has a lot of records, but you'll notice that it's for each different type of 1099 by year. So what I would want to do is I would want to say where the year, let's see, where my year is 2027, and where my amount paid is greater than 0. So then this gives me a list of my qualified transactions that are going to report on 1099. And from here, you can go and make the changes in the system. There is a 1099 report in the smart list already. I will say I kind of gave up on it a few years ago, and I just used my own SQL view because I've come across some conflicting information compared to when the report runs. You may use that. This may be a better solution for you. Wanted to point that out. If your 1099 data is not right, and there are plenty of reasons that may happen, you have options. It really just depends on what it is that has happened. So you can modify the transactions individually or in bulk. Here, this is going to be moving. So imagine a scenario where you set up the vendor and you didn't flag them as 1099, but they should have been. This will update all transactions or move them from 1099 bucket out of it. This particular one, you can edit individual transactions. Under purchasing transactions, edit 1099 transaction. So you can go in and change the 1099 amount. That field is editable in that screenshot. So if it was flagged 1099 and it should not have been, or partially should have been, this is common for employees, especially employees who also do other ad hoc business with the company. But certainly for any reason, you can use that. And then lastly, you can just edit the totals. If you're in a pinch, you can come into the cards 1099 details and just manually update the totals in here. Now, naturally, it won't reconcile back to the transactions in the system, but you can do it that way. And then lastly, to print them, you're going to go ahead into purchasing routines, print 1099, and print the forms here, and you have your 1099s ready to go. If you do use encumbrance management, there is a routine that you can optionally run to move available budget dollars into the new year. So I have the routine there for you as well. But we started this discussion on payables. We talked about payables, some cool things you can do for the payables, hopefully some helpful tips and tricks for year end. Don't forget your tax is optional after this as well. Real easy to do, routines, year end close, and pick the buckets you want to close, either fiscal, calendar, or both, and close your year. Here's our checklist, a little bit more information in here, because if you wanted to do a pre-1099 run, I left that in there. You don't have to do that, but I left that in there for the calendar checklist as well. So see, if you're just worrying about closing your fiscal, those steps 4, 5, 6, they're not, or 7 are not included in there. Next up is the inventory module. I know a lot of the folks that I work with over the years do a lot of work in the inventory module. This is something, it updates those yearly quantity buckets as well. So if you're using those buckets like we talked about earlier, this is going to update those. What I recommend running this is for a couple reasons. One, because you can remove discontinued items, you can remove sold lot attributes, kind of clean up the system a little bit, but you can also use this time to update your item standard cost. If you're not familiar with inventory and those things just flew right over your head, that's not a problem. It doesn't apply to you, no worries. I wanted to include it in here just so that the information was readily available for folks who do need it. I also recommend, just from my consulting background, printing these reports. I would print them or scan them or print them to a text file, the ones highlighted in blue there, and just make sure you have those air quote year-end reports so that you can see the status of the inventory prior to closing. Now, you want to make sure that you have all of your inventory, your sales transactions, your purchasing transactions, whether that's sales orders or purchase orders, everything posted, including inventory adjustments, before you go through this process. Everything should be posted. Don't forget that all important backup. I have a couple of slides in here, y'all, that talk about what each one of these options are. I already talked about them briefly, but discontinued items, sold lot attributes, and sold receipts, which has a cutoff date, which is nice. So you probably want to keep a little bit of history there. And optionally, the standard cost. So I put a little bit of information here for those who are using the inventory module. You probably have a pretty standard process for this, but I thought it would be helpful to at least show what these options are, because we do this just once a year and it's easy to forget. So nice little refresher, and obviously updating your item standard cost, probably a pretty good time. But if you have a different process in place, I would follow that. Just the fiscal year close, no calendar year close. Because of the reconcile option for inventory quantities, if you elect to reconcile, I would, without a doubt, make sure that you do that in a test environment first. Do not run the reconcile in your live company without testing the results in a test company first. Please heed that warning. I've seen that cause so many issues to so many customers over the years. Just be sure to test it. Next up on our list is payroll. Now, certainly, if you don't run payroll out of Dynamics GP, this does not apply to you. But if you do run payroll out of GP, there are some things, now predominantly talking US based here, but there are some things that you really need to be aware of when it comes to closing the payroll module. So naturally, who should run it if you use it? Or if you're using GP just to track for ACA purposes, this is a good refresher for you as well. There are some components to this. We talked about the year-end update early on in our discussion, but another area is the tax table changes. So every year, the governments, make changes, and there are tax table changes that need to get applied as well. It is a separate process. So we want to make sure to talk about it that way. So we have the tax update the software update, which does not need to be installed after your last pay run, but you want to make sure that you still have the 2019 tax rates in place because you can continue running payroll in this year. The tax rate update, that is a time-sensitive update. That has to be applied to your system after your last payroll of the fiscal year, of the calendar year is complete, but before you process before you calculate your first payroll of the new calendar year. Very important step. You can go to the 2020 tax rates and then revert back to 2019 temporarily so that you can make some changes. Those are all workarounds. It is a sensitive time of year for any process, any software that's running payroll. Timing is important there. For GP, it is 2 steps. Be sure to talk with your partner or your IT team about that. A little bit more of a lengthy step in this process because of the year-end wage file and the W-2 process and the software update and the tax table update. So I get these directly from Microsoft out on the knowledge base and the blogs. But I wanted to make sure that you know a couple things that can help save you time. So if you do use GP for ACA tracking, Integrity Data offers a free tool for GP 15, 16, and 18. I put my friend Tom Francis' email on here. Email him, tell him that you saw this on my slide. It's a small install that gets added to your GP, and you get an additional drop-down where you can easily change the offer codes and the safe harbor codes and the costs directly associated with the employee and their family members. If you know what I'm talking about and you manage ACA and GP, this is a dream come true. So be sure to check it out and get it installed in your system to make that easier for you to manage. Also, for year-end wage files, you don't have to wait. You don't have to audit those W-2s after your last payroll. You can start now. You can run a year-end wage file now. You just have to make sure you run it one more time after your last payroll. Now, if you were to run it now, any changes you make, you do want to save them until the end of the year or make the change directly in GP, because every time you run the year-end wage file, it's going to overwrite those buckets. So if you haven't made the change directly in GP, then it's going to get overwritten. So what I mean by that is don't just go into the Edit W-2 window and manually change it until after your last payroll. After your last payroll, you're free to do that. If you're not sure how to apply the tax codes, I have a nice little blog about it. It's pretty easy to do. It's an automatic process you can run within GP. Just wanted to make sure I shared that with you. And if your IT department or your partner is helping you with the year-end update, they'll probably have, they should have that included in their project plan to get the tax code updated when the time is correct. If you haven't updated your tax code in a while, probably good to check on that. Here's another little tip. This little SQL script, Microsoft published this a couple of years ago. This is an hours report. So if you want to get a smart list that shows hours that are in your system, this is how to do that. Another one is a SQL view for year-end wage smart list. So if you're like me and you want to get that information off of a GP report and you want to see it in smart list, you can create that real easily. Now mine is empty. I have none because I did not create my year-end wage file. Now, what we didn't talk about was how to run the closing of payroll. So let me go into payroll. It's real simple. I'm going to go into routines, year-end closing. I'm going to tell it the year, choose process. I'm going to choose whether or not I want to carry over my year-to-date PTO. It's going to update all the W-2 buckets. Now, when that's finished, then our smart list will contain data. And without that year-end wage file, this smart list looks at that year-end wage file. So without that data being in there, there's nothing in there. And look at how beautiful this is. If you've ever tried to get this data out of a GP report. This is all your state wages by state, Medicare, Social Security, federal. That is a SQL view that you can create and build a smart list on for year-end wage data. If you do that and it's empty, remember, you need to have a year-end wage file in place in order for that to work. Printing W-2s, if you're not familiar with the change that happened in GP 2016, you don't have to buy the W-2 forms anymore. You can choose the form type one wide forms with box. That's one wide forms with box, and it will actually print the W-2 lines for you, so you don't have to buy them at Office Depot or Office Max, whatever they're called nowadays. Pretty cool. For closing payroll, real simple. We already did that a little bit, but I wanted to point that out in these steps. Once you run that year-end wage file, then data becomes available, like I said, in that smart list, but also in your edit W-2 window for you to make changes. So maybe an address, or you had someone inadvertently was taxed at a higher rate and you just need to do a quick manual adjustment. All that is available in there. The list is a little lengthy for payroll because it's sensitive and important. Everybody likes to get paid. I have a couple backup steps in here. This is because we're running the W-2s and the 1099-Rs. Be sure to work through those steps. When I closed payroll, I went into routines, year-end closing. It really is that easy. Hit process on the year. Now, I've already closed the year. So remember I said you can run the year-end wage file anytime you want. So if I want to get rid of the year-end wage file, I just go to process and it says, hey, you already have year-end wage information in there. Do you want to delete it? All I have to do is delete it and not recreate it. And now that year-end wage file is erased and it's ready for me to continue processing payroll throughout the year. That's pretty cool. Be sure to check that out. Coming into the home stretch here, closing the financial module. This is obviously the meat and potatoes where it gets really, really important. Oh, and I mean really important. A lot of cool things here. First, don't forget the backups. Second, everything else should be posted, whether that's a transaction coming from an inventory adjustment, whether that's a payables transaction, payroll, everything should be posted. And because what this process does, as you're probably aware, is it takes anything flagged as a P&L account and it closes them out or zeroes them out to the retained earnings accounts, and it updates your balance sheet accounts. So in order for that to happen properly, those transactions have to be posted, right? An open year is then flagged as history, and your new year is available to be used. It's actually available to be used without closing. We'll talk about that here in a minute as well. So, couple things. The backup's really important. Do you use unit accounts? Are you on an older version of GP? If you are, unit accounts don't zero out automatically. I've got a little script in here you can use. Make sure you print your pre-closing financial statements. You may feel like that's not a big step, but yeah, I would go ahead and just have it, save them off as a PDF or as a text file or an Excel, just so you have them. You need to verify the general ledger setup windows is correct. Your new fiscal year is likely already created, but you need to have that in place as well before you run the year-end routine. If you use analytical counting, I put a link in here directly from Microsoft talking about analytical counting and year-end. There's no separate year-end close procedure for AA, but do check out this support KPI, or knowledge base, excuse me, just to make sure that you're aware of all the impacts of analytical counting at year-end. This is that little script. So if you're on an older version of GP and you do use unit accounts, you can run this and it'll clear out. They'll keep the balance. So you see on the screen, in older versions of GP, unit accounts close out like their balance sheet accounts. If you want those statistics to continue, you're going to use this script. Do you have to wait until your audit is over to close the year? You probably are already shaking your head. Yes, I hope not, because the answer is no. You really don't have to wait. Now, some folks do, and there are some dependencies surrounding that. Maybe their management report or reports are already customized to accommodate a wide open or a lengthy closing process. But the reality is you don't have to hold open your year because audit entries, the year is, you can reopen the year and you can even post to history, which does a recreation or a rerunning of the zeroing out of your P&L accounts to your retained earnings. So no real reason to keep it open that I can think of. If you have one, email me and let me know and we could talk about it. But it's best to go ahead and close it, protect that year. And if somebody needs to post into that year, you can they can submit a request and you can reopen the year. That's not a problem at all. The beauty of that is that everything becomes in the historic in Dynamics GP. So all of your financial statements will run properly and as intended. Now in red, make sure your posting to history option is checked under financial setup general ledger. So let's take a look at that real quick. Financial setup general ledger. This checkbox right here, posting to history. You only have to have that checked when you want to post to history. So my advice is to turn it off until you are in a position where you need to post to the previous year. You could only post back to the most recently closed year, meaning if the most recently closed year was 2014, because I do leave my years open, that's the only one I can post into. So if I need to post back 2 years, you can reverse the closing of a year, which frees it up to be considered an open company, and you can post back even further that way. So we'll leave that checked for now. But that is how you would do that. Now, that box has to be checked in order for it to happen, and you can only close the most recently closed fiscal year. Real important before you close is to audit your account posting types. Why is that? Well, if I go into accounts and I look at my posting type, this is what I'm talking about right here, this field. The only thing that this does is it identifies whether or not this account's balance will get closed out to a retained earnings account by being profit and loss, or if it will be carried forward with a balance brought forward as a balance sheet. So the system doesn't care that your 6500 series is a P&L account. If it is set to balance sheet, it will have a balance brought forward. So we want to make sure that we audit those. Now, a lot of folks have a lot of chart of accounts, a lot of account codes. So what we do is we build a smart list based on the accounts, real easy. And we're going to use some search function, balance sheet accounts. Here's my list of balance sheet accounts. And you see, let me look at my search. What I'm saying is my main account segment is greater than 4,000. And if it is greater than 4,000, is the posting type set to profit and loss? Or in this case, excuse me, less than 4,000. Is it set to profit and loss? I've also excluded unit accounts. So you see this 1100, this is a balance sheet account, an asset account, but it is set to profit and loss. So this balance, if I didn't audit this, would get closed out to my retained earning account. So I'm going to come in, make the change, refresh my list, and there we go. It's an empty list. We'll do the same thing on income statement accounts, and I'm good to go. That search is, nope, let me close that. That search is greater than 3999. Now yours might be different depending on how your numbering system is, and is equal to balance sheet. So all we're doing is managing this by exception, but you definitely want to do that audit before closing the year. Otherwise, things will be closed out to in an incorrect way. Another good link for analytical accounting when it comes to year-end close. So I thought I would share that. I'm not going to really go into that. If you run into a situation, and I see this a lot, where management reporter reports are not working because you haven't closed the year, or maybe you have, this is likely because of how they're built. Not that there's a real issue, but there are different approaches you can take to building a report to management reporter, depending on whether you intend it to be run with the year open, but you want to consider it history, or if you want it to be used as intended. So I would advise to not modify your reports, not spend the money or the effort to modify your reports, just close the year. Because honestly, like I said, you can open it back up to post your audit entries if you need to. Remember how I said about how important that auditing of the GL account posting type was? Well, what happens if you close and an account type was set wrong? This happens a lot, and I put it in here intentionally because I don't want it to happen to you. If that happens, don't do a thing yet. Just pause Don't move a muscle. Don't try to do a journal entry. Don't change anything yet. Don't fix the account. Don't do anything. The first thing you should do is reverse the closing. Go into routines, year-end closing, and reverse historical year. That's going to remove the closing for you. Then you make the change and correct the account and reclose. If you change the account beforehand, reversing it will have even more complicated behavior. So you want to undo what you did first, which is close, then make the correction and close the year again. Year-end close options. This is really important. Another one of those areas where I just kind of scratch my head and say why. But year-end close options, the closing of the year is done. I think I was already in there, but under financial routines, year-end closing. If I open this window up, you see I get to specify my retained earnings account. It comes from this setup window. You could change it here. The journal entry number is defaulted. But then here I have remove unused segment numbers. Remove unused segment numbers. I recommend not checking that. If you really truly want to remove unused segment numbers, I recommend just going and doing it manually. If you've got a tremendous amount and you've audited it, that's what that's for. But just to be safe, I make a general recommendation to leave it unchecked. However, maintain inactive accounts. This should be checked. This should be checked. If you don't check this, if it stays unchecked, inactive accounts will get removed from your system. If I check it and I say with budget amounts, the only ones that will stay in the system are the ones that have budget amounts. So in my mind, you want to always make sure that maintain inactive accounts is checked and all inactive accounts is checked. If you need to remove inactive accounts, I would recommend just, again, doing that manually without worrying about this year-end process. Even if your inactive accounts are zero, this causes a lot of problems, and it can be really, really stressful to resolve. It may be zero now because it's inactive, but last year it had a balance. So when you run comparative financial statements, it's just not going to work because the account is not there anymore. And that's the biggest problem with this function. Even though it's zero now, running historic reports just simply won't work. So I would recommend checking this and making it all inactive accounts. There is no undo. If you leave this unmarked and you close the year, when you reverse, if you reverse it, it doesn't put them back. So you need to make sure that this is what you're doing. And then you go to close year. Notice my year, it's telling me what year I'm going to close, because it has to close the years in order. So 2023 was closed. 2024 is my next one. I want to close it. It warns me if I've got batches out there. I want to go look at those. I want to make sure everything is posted. I get a closing report, which is essentially my journal entry. I get my analytical accounting reports. So now if I were to run this again, you see my year is moved up. I promised you that you could post in history. You can. You can also reverse. So if I reverse, I'm going to open up 2024. You would want to use my cautionary words at the beginning of our discussion and back up before each and every one of these steps. And oops, I don't want to do 2023. So now it's all set. 2024 is open. Really is that easy. I haven't talked about fixed assets. We're up against the bottom of the hour, but I do want to briefly talk about fixed assets. The reason I have them last is because technically, you can close fixed assets after you close general ledger. Why? Well, because remember, you can post the history. And why would you want to wait? Well, a lot of times you don't find out about things like retirements or capitalizing something that you thought was going to be expensed until the audit. Or maybe even into January. So you could close fixed assets after general ledger as long as you have post to history open, because you could post these to history. If you're not worried about that part and your fixed assets are clean, you're ready to go, you can close it before GL. You can't undo a fixed asset closing, which is another reason why it might make sense to wait a couple weeks. And you also get tax changes that might affect the depreciation that you've run. So there's a little bit of reasons there. There are a couple reports on the right-hand side that I recommend running. And depending on your version, in older versions, you couldn't really look at historic status or historic net book value. Those concerns have gone to the wayside in more modern versions, but I still recommend just to run those. I'm just re-highlighting the fact that you can close fixed assets after general ledger as long as that post history is flagged and the fiscal period is open in your fiscal period setup window. Fixed historic depreciation reports, there's an SSRS report link there if you want to run them in SSRS, just for your reference. Reports fixed assets depreciation, I would run that for all of them. Make sure you have that saved off on the side. This is the screenshot for depreciation, those depreciation reports. So you would want to run that as of the end of the year. Real easy to do. You close each book. You see in the screenshot, I've got my 3 books there. I can close one book at a time, or I can close them all. You may want to close, all your internal books before the end of, before you close your federal, for example, or your state. But you could close them all at once as well. Again, there's no undo, so make sure you get those backups and reports run. Yeah, obviously, you'd have to have everything posted. You'd have to have all your assets set up. You'd have to run depreciation. You'd have to run to hire things. You'd have to process all that before doing so, because you can't post the fixed assets data in historic fixed assets. You can only post it to historical GL. So make sure all your fixed asset transactions are posted, and you are good to go. That brings us to the end of our time here together today. I will turn it back over to David. I have some contact information here for both of us. David, did you have any questions that folks had sent in to the queue?
That was fantastic, Shawn. No, the only question was about getting the content of the presentation, and we will be sending this out as soon as the Teams video also streams. We'll be putting that out on our YouTube, and we'll make sure we get those who are registered and attended this event. We'll make sure they have both the content and the recording as well.
Awesome.
Other than that, just keep an eye out for our newsletter and follow us on social media. And again, our emails are there, and Shawn and I look forward to helping you out.
Thank you, everyone.